Okay, today we're going to talk about the Great Depression's major effect on much of Latin America, especially the very large population countries that you see in the list here. The general effect is that, much like in the United States, it really fractures a lot of political systems and especially political parties as they have to realign their messages in order to win elections. Many people in the United States and in Latin America and in Europe and really throughout the world were so angry at the Great Depression and angry at what they often viewed as the wealthy elite landowners or industrialists or companies or whatever that they believe had caused the Great Depression through their greed and are largely avoiding it because they're already very wealthy, and the normal people suffer the most during the Great Depression, along with the poor. So a lot of voters and other social groups throughout many of these societies become very angry at what they see as the elite system, elites in government, and new political parties will rise and old ones will adapt themselves to reach out to those voters to try to win elections or otherwise gain and keep political power. So populism rises very consistently around the world in especially the 1930s and going into the 1940s. So we'll talk specifically about these four countries in the list here and their experience with what caused populism to rise in their country in the 30s and how populism played out in the 1930s and changed a lot of the political landscape. So we'll first start with Chile, around 1924 or so. So by this point, 1924, the Chilean government has started making some legal reforms, has started talking about giving more rights and powers to its growing working class and labor union movements. And even the military, which is always kind of in the background in Chilean politics, really with a lot of power. The military had started pressuring the Chilean Congress, the lawmakers, to enact a certain amount of legal reforms by mid-1924, largely because they feared that if Congress and the lawmakers did nothing, that the unions and the working class would make very big demands and might even achieve them that could really destabilize the society and especially was worrisome to the elite wealthy families. So many historians argue that the military's push for some legal reforms for the working class in mid-1924 was actually an attempt to delay or undercut a larger, more ambitious movement amongst the working class to get even more for themselves. So it might have been an attempt to kind of preempt a larger worker empowerment movement, or that movement might push for even more radical laws from Congress. So the army largely gets behind this push, trying to influence Congress to pass at least something, even if it's kind of moderate. And when Congress started opening these debates, in the middle of the debates, the army actually kind of split over which side it wants to support in these debates, the unionizing working classes or the what Marx would call the bourgeoisie kind of ownership class. And the ownership class, the elites, were very worried that the unions were just on the edge of taking control over the whole country and really doing whatever they want democratically anyway. So the sitting president at this point resigns, named Alessandro. He resigned in late 1925, just as his presidential term was ending, and hands power over to the Minister of War at the time, a colonel named Carlos Ibanez. So Ibanez took over the government as Minister of War and basically continued to run the country from that cabinet position even after another president was elected late in 1925. So elections do happen, but Ibanez is still really the political power that's making the big decisions and kind of pushing the elected president to endorse it. And just a couple of years later, really a year and a half later, the military and Congress then put Ibanez into the presidency, full blown. He is the president from May 1927 onward. And from that point, he started to build a dictatorship under himself that jailed all of his opponents and critics, jailed labor leaders, suspended normal civil rights in the country. So he's quickly building a dictatorship under himself for the long term to solidify political control. Ibanez does several things to try to convince the population, and especially the big power players in Chilean politics, to support this transition toward a dictatorship. So he invested in railroad funding, in general roads that cars would drive on. So there's a lot of infrastructure building during his term. He invested a lot in power plants, so electrification of the country, which in the early 1900s was a fairly normal thing that many countries around the world were going through. They're trying to get access to consistent electricity. A lot of this infrastructure building and other projects he was leading heavily depended on foreign loans from foreign banks. It depended on worldwide economic growth, and it also depended on, especially investors from the United States, building more mines in Chile. Mining was really the backbone of the Chilean economy at that point. So those three kinds of areas of revenue were what really funded his very ambitious infrastructure projects. And then the 1929 Wall Street crash happened in the United States, which destabilized the worldwide banking system and eventually led to the Great Depression. So the Chilean government is in a very bad position at that point because the major sources of revenue for the government to continue building that infrastructure and that politicians like Ibanez rely on to stay popular enough to stay in power, that funding pretty much disappears within a few months after the Wall Street crash, as the bankers are largely trying to save themselves from bankruptcy. So the Depression is hugely destabilizing in Chile as it gets going by 1930, 1931. You start getting mass popular protest in Chile against the Depression and against what they say are the poor political and economic decisions that the government has made. Those protests start off as general working class and poor people protesting, demanding more from their government and better governance. But by 1931, starts to include what we call white-collar workers, kind of middle-class workers. People are not so much menial laborers out in the mines or the farms or anything like that, but they are bankers, investors, teachers, lawyers, doctors, general workers that have college degrees, have higher level of training or education to get those types of higher paying jobs. When that kind of middle class of white-collar workers starts to join these protests in 1931, that is what pushed Ibanez to resign from office in July. After Ibanez resigned in July of 31, there were several different governments that tried to set up a congressional majority and try to get their people into the executive branch to run the government. So this goes on for about a year into summer 1932. So several different attempts were made to cobble together some type of majority to actually get things done. Really none of them works until there's a 1932 presidential election that the former president Arturo Alessandri won, so he will become president, and he will be a fairly conservative right-wing type of president who basically argues that we need to stabilize the country, stabilize the workers enough so that they'll stop these protests and stop kind of upending the system, really. So Alessandri mostly wanted to keep law and order, he wanted to keep stability, while also pushing programs to try to fight the Great Depression and unemployment and whatnot. But his major initiatives are basically to reduce public spending in order to balance the government budget. He dismantled several government programs, including employment programs. So that was largely not very popular with a lot of the working class. But at the exact same time, going into the mid 1930s, the Chilean economy starts to recover and actually does much better than most other economies around the world by 1937. Largely because world demand for Chilean exports, largely from the Chilean mines, mineral mines, have recovered by about 1937. So the Chilean economy is recovering much better than most other countries from the Depression. And that recovery drove unemployment back down to fairly normal levels. Inflation was still around, so unless workers got very good wages, their wages wouldn't keep up with inflation in society. But Alessandri was able to stay in power based on the fairly decent recovery in the economy relative to other economies in the world at the time. Another election occurs in 1938, and this is an interesting election mostly because there's a split in the political parties. Alessandri had led the kind of normal conservative type party in Chile for years. The leftist parties in Chile had many different political parties, and they united under what was called a Popular Front idea in 1938. The Popular Front is an international theory that largely comes out of the Soviet Union, so the leading communist country of the time. The Soviet leaders had argued that the biggest threat to communism in the 1930s is not so much industrial capitalism or general democracy like in the United States. They argue that the bigger threat was instead fascism. Countries like what Germany and Italy are doing in the 1930s, where they have consolidated government power under a dictatorship, and that dictatorship is making deals with the industrial companies and the bourgeoisie to fight off the depression, try to stay in power. So the Soviet Union saw fascism as a greater threat to communism than really liberal democracy. So the Soviet Union argued to communist parties and other kind of leftist politicians around the world that they should, instead of arguing against each other, they should all unite under one general kind of leftist type political party in order to win elections or somehow get into power. And they often called that political party, that kind of unity umbrella party, the Popular Front. So Chilean politicians get involved in this, and it really works in Chile, at least in 1938. The general different kind of leftist political parties in Chile, the socialists, communists, the liberal Democrats, the radicals, they all gather together under a Popular Front type party that they call the Confederation of Chilean Workers. So what that eventually results in is a kind of compromise presidential candidate amongst all these different parties named Pedro Aguirre Cerda. And they agreed to all endorse him at the same time as their presidential candidate, and he goes out and runs in 1938 and actually wins the election just barely over Alessandri's party by only around 4,000 votes, so a very small percentage of the population. The major problem for the Popular Front, though, is that it's an umbrella movement of many different parties that have been arguing against each other for years and years. So it's very hard once they're in power, once they're in office, to actually pass laws because one faction wants one thing, another faction wants another. So they constantly argue and bicker during debates in the legislature and even in the media. And their ideas are different from each other, but they're all generally pretty leftist and pretty supportive of the working class, which tended to scare landowners and industrialists and the elite, the kind of people that Alessandri's party had represented. So even while the left kind of fractures and fragments and argues amongst itself, it generally unites the right the right side, the Conservative Party. Um, so there's not a whole lot of big legislation that comes out of Chile because of these arguments. Probably the biggest thing that Cerda was able to implement was a Corporación de Fomento, which is really the kind of industrial corporation idea, that this will be a partnership between the government and private companies to direct government revenue and private investment into the places in the economy that will be best to spur industrialization, that will get industrialization going and be more effective and be faster. So that's one of the bigger changes for Chile in the 1930s. The problem with that, though, is that Alessandri's Conservative Party often controlled Congress to some extent and tended to limit the amount of money that the government was putting forward into this system. So the Conservatives tried to limit the government's contribution to the Corporación de Fomento. And that kind of hamstrung how much it could really accomplish. President Serra resigned in 1941 mostly due to bad health. So he backs out. He has to retire really in the middle of his presidential term, and so the presidency fell to another guy named Juan Antonio Rios. His big policy in 1941 going forward to 1943 basically is to keep Chile out of World War II. World War II had started in Europe in 1939, had started between Japan and China earlier in the 1930s, so it's ongoing and happening in 41, and will drag the United States in late 41, early 42. So this next president's big job, as he sees it, is to keep Chile out of the war and neutral, largely so that Chile could sell goods to any country that it wanted to. The next major kind of leader for Chile is named Gabriel González Videla. He led the Radical Party to win the 1946 elections just after World War II ended. He took a lot of leftist support from even around the world, so communist parties from other parts of the world gave his party money and kind of helped him win that election. And surprisingly, once he got into office, he stopped workers from striking and did some very surprising things for someone from a radical party. And that attack on strikers encouraged more conservative politicians in Chile to go after any communist that they accused in the country, and passed a law banning the Communist Party from even running in elections after 1948. So this is all getting going 46, 47, 48, just as the Cold War is starting and heating up. So the United States is backing a lot of this kind of attack on communist parties and communists in Latin America. And eventually that kind of anti-communist witch hunt will take down President Videla himself, and will go after anybody who was associated with the old Popular Front from the late 30s, before World War II, before the Cold War. And it's largely the same kind of thing that happened in the United States. Anyone who was associated with a leftist or a communist party before the war would be kind of painted as a national traitor as the Cold War gets going. So Chile will start to undergo that kind of problem as well. And the next country we'll go to is Brazil. And Brazil is an interesting case study of Latin America in the 1930s, largely because there is a big split in political opinion between the working class supported leftist types of political parties and politicians and the elitist parties on the right. And neither one of them seem to be able to gather enough support in order to take majorities in Congress or to get presidents elected or anything like this. And that will allow a politician kind of space to manipulate both sides and build a dictatorship under himself eventually. So again, the Great Depression largely caused these big kind of polarization, as historians tend to call it, in political opinion in Brazil. Polarization means that people who had been kind of moderate in the middle politically are pushed to the extremes, either extreme left or the extreme right. So they're pushed to the extreme poles. So if you're thinking about a map, people who would be like kind of moderate, like in the middle on the equator on a map, on a world map, are pushed to the edges, like the North and South Pole, just by what's going on in the world, the worldwide economic catastrophe that was the Great Depression. That hit Brazil pretty hard. And then World War II followed in its wake. So we'll talk a little bit about the two different kind of groups as we go forward. On the right, there is really a fascist-inspired group that calls itself the Integralists, or the Integralist Party, or the Integralism theory. It's basically a very conservative movement in the 1930s in Brazil that's based in Christianity as a kind of quasi-official religion of the movement. It's very nationalistic. It wants to see Brazil as one of the better countries in the world and shouldn't have to listen to or really deal much with the rest of the world and shouldn't allow a lot of immigration and things like that, and a very traditional kind of culture and society. So, and it also had a lot of military people involved in that party. They were outwardly militaristic. Even people that were not in the military used militaristic rhetoric, and the party created its own military-looking uniforms, basically, and they paraded around, marching around as if they were in the military. But there were a lot of military officers involved in this Integralist Party, especially from the Navy. And again, because this is era of political polarization, a lot of middle-class people, doctors and lawyers and professors and teachers and on, they joined this party. Because they think that stability is the most important thing for the country. And on the left, you have what is called the Aliança Libertadora Nacional, which is basically the National Liberation Alliance. It was another one of these popular front ideas that was kind of an umbrella organization for the many leftist parties that had already existed in Brazil before the Depression had even started. The big person who is able to take advantage of this major split in Brazilian politics is named Getúlio Vargas. Now, he was just becoming president in 1930 as the Depression is really getting going and starting to spread around the world. So Vargas had quite a lot of support amongst the Integralists. They see him as someone who is very open to their ideas. Communists, though, see him as a great enemy. So even as Vargas is kind of running the country and trying to deal with the Depression in fairly moderate ways, the communists tried a revolution in November 1935 against him and trying to overthrow the whole government. It largely seemed to start off with some left-wing officers in the military and then spread to state capitals. Brazil has many states just like the United States, so it spread to a lot of capital cities and state legislatures and then spread from there. It completely failed within just a few days. The government is able to defeat the coup, and Vargas remains in power as president. But Vargas said that he learned from that politics are so dangerous in this moment, and he suspects that there are other communists that have gotten away and that are planning to try to overthrow the government still on a continuing basis, that Vargas argues for a suspension of constitutional rights, and the Congress approved. So he got a law passed that basically suspended equal rights, really, in the country under the Constitution for an unknown amount of time, really, until the emergency passed. And Vargas used that power to then launch a wave of repression against his enemies, especially leftists and communists and others. That included torture, it included arrest without much evidence, it even included very short trials for the accused. So many people are harmed by this. And Vargas seems to use this moment to destroy the political left so that they're never a threat to him again. And the integralists for themselves very much anticipated going into the 1938 elections that now that they have really given Vargas this opportunity, that he's going to work with them, and that they're going to be popular enough, especially now that the leftist parties have been broken in the country, that they're going to win the 1938 elections, and that they're going to have kind of a free hand to nominate whoever they want to be president, and they're going to take a congressional majority, and they're thinking they're going to win the elections and then basically run the country after that. Vargas had other plans, though. He didn't trust the integralist, and he thought that in order for him to remain president, he wasn't very confident in really getting renominated or getting elected in the 38 elections. So he decided to put off the elections, and he declared a national emergency in late 1937, basically saying that there was another communist plot that had been uncovered trying to overthrow the government. So he would have to delay the elections in 1938 and accumulate more power under the presidency to keep stability. So there just are not any elections in 1938, and Vargas continues in the presidency. And at the same time, he also announced what becomes known as the Estado Novo, which means the new state, the new government, really. And it will be a very new government. Vargas personally, he and his advisors rewrote the Brazilian Constitution. They dissolved Congress so that the governing administration will basically enforce the laws as the laws are, and the lawmakers are not meeting in order to pass new laws or debate changes to existing laws or anything like that. So Congress is out of session for quite a long time, and the presidential administration basically runs the country. So it gets this idea gets a lot of military support from the army leaders, the high-level officers, and it appears that Vargas made a deal with them, offering them bigger budgets and more promotions, more soldiers and military hardware, really, in exchange for protecting him and going along with all of this. So this is largely a type of fascist dictatorship. There's no elections. There's no elected lawmakers anymore. They're sitting at home, really. And that's largely what a fascist dictatorship is. The leader is in power. They're running the government. They might announce new decrees or new policies or something like that. They often do not have the power to change laws because they're not a lawmaker. It's just that they have kept the legislature at bay by sending them home. And the Estado Novo is very repressive, especially against leftists and communists and other leftist parties and whatnot. It's also very repressive against foreign businessmen, so there's a certain amount of populism in it. And it used a lot of state power, especially police power, arrest without much evidence, torture of suspected criminals, and even torture of suspected conspirators against the government, and the constant pushing off of elections to some later date. So it also, the Estado Novo also uses a lot of censorship, which is another general thing that fascist dictatorships tend to do. The Estado Novo created its own government news agency, so that news agency took statements from the government, read them off fairly uncritically, just this is happening and it's really a great thing, and that government news agency wasn't allowed to really criticize or complain about what the government was doing, or even really analyze what the government is doing in a whole lot of depth. And it also censored private privately owned news organizations, often closing them down if they complain too much or criticize the government too much. So this is becoming a totalitarian system in Brazil, very reminiscent of Germany under Hitler and the Nazi Party, but not as extreme as the Nazi Party, but still pretty awful in Brazil itself. And the integralist leaders are so angry at a lot of this stuff. They like a lot of the fascist ideas very often that Vargas is bringing forward. But again, remember that they wanted that 1938 election to happen because they thought they were going to win and take power anyway. So their complaint against Vargas is largely that he's not letting the elections go forward. So integralist leaders, and especially even the rank and file members of the Integralist Party, they grow impatient with Vargas by 1938, and they started a coup attempt against the government, trying to basically overthrow Vargas's government, kick him out, and hopefully hold new elections. But that coup attempt failed in February of 38. They even attacked the presidential palace, but the coup failed, and the government went forward with investigations and arrested people it suspected, and had really captured all of the conspirators within about 24 hours or so. And Vargas goes on and names himself president for the long-term future, and even says that any elections in the country will be delayed until at least 1943. And of course, once World War I really gets going and comes to the Americas by 1941-42, then Vargas uses the excuse of that war going on to delay the 1943 elections even further into the future. So there's a lot of people around the country that are very angry at all this. But there's also a lot of people that are fairly happy about it. There's a lot of populism also in the Estado Novo. There's a lot of complaint in Brazil that the economic elites have been running the country and corrupted the government for their own benefit, and they don't care about the poor or the working class, and that's the cause of all the inequality and the social and economic problems. And that fed into how bad the depression has gotten in Brazil. So Vargas made sure to put a lot of populist ideas into the Estado Novo in order to keep popularity and also address some of those complaints. So one of the biggest ones is that he built a lot of government-run agricultural systems. So the government will run production on farms of a lot of different goods, from cocoa and coffee, sugar, tea, a lot of the big staple cash crops that Brazil produces to sell in the international market. The Estado Novo also created similar state-run companies to direct industrialization, to sometimes take over factories. And the biggest and most famous example of that is the so-called National Motor Factory that produced car and truck engines and also airplane engines. The Estado Novo also created a merit-based government system for promotion that would replace the old corrupted favoritism system for promotion that had existed before, which was a major complaint of the general population, that the people in power just promoted into the government bureaucracy their own family members and friends and whatnot, and corrupt supporters. The Estado Novo also created a large new labor law that tried to stabilize a lot of what we call kind of labor-industrial relations. It largely allowed unions to exist, and that the government would protect their existence from being attacked by corporate owners, what Marx called the bourgeoisie. And the labor ministry was put in charge of kind of overseeing union finances and making sure there's no fraud or embezzlement or anything. And the labor ministry was also put in charge of overseeing and certifying labor elections, union elections. The problem with the labor laws, though, is that Brazil still doesn't have a whole lot of industrialization. So the few factories on a big scale that exist in Brazil are largely in the biggest cities, Sao Paulo or Rio de Janeiro. So the labor code really only affected those big factories in the big cities, and the rest of Brazil's industrial centers aren't really touched very much by the labor law to the extent that industrialization even existed outside of those two big cities. And Vargas, as the 1943 elections are kind of upcoming before he delays them again, he realizes that this populist stance is very popular amongst the Brazilian population. So he continued with it. He tried to kind of double down on it in order to stay popular enough, hopefully, to get reelected at some point, whenever he allows those elections to actually happen in the future. So he starts some more symbolic acts to continue kind of populist statements coming out of the government about supporting the working class or building an entire new labor party or further reforms that would raise wages or something like this. But a lot of it is just kind of rumors and slogans without a whole lot of big government action to actually implement some of those ideas. Probably the biggest and most popular one that they did implement was increasing restrictions on foreign companies under the statement that foreign companies have become monopolies in Brazil, and in order to break those monopolies, those companies have to be restricted in some way. So that was a popular idea amongst the Brazilian population, but obviously will anger those foreign companies, especially the ones that are based in the United States. So a lot of U.S. companies and corporate leaders who have political contacts with the U.S. government will start complaining that Brazil is going too far because that's hitting their company on its bottom line, its profit margin, which is something you obviously often see happening in the connections between business leaders and governments. There's some other fairly popular things that the Vargas government does by the 1940s. They start releasing communist leaders from jail in the 1940s. Some of them have been in prison for years, going all the way back to the attempted coup attempts in 1935. They make the Communist Party legal again, so it can actually legally exist without people meeting for Communist parties getting arrested and thrown in jail. And the Communist Party, at some point, whenever elections are allowed to happen, will be allowed to run in those elections. So as Vargas tries to appeal more to leftist and popular elements throughout the country, that angered a lot of the people on the other side of the spectrum, the integralists, who want more stability and want more military power to run the country. So as he kind of pivoted to appeal to the left, the people on the right got angry at him and start conspiring to remove him from office. So eventually a alliance between military leaders and some moderate constitutionalist parties and politicians are so angry at him by 1945 that they are able to launch a military coup against him in 1945 that forced him to resign. And that sends us on to the next country, which is Colombia. And Colombia is following, in the 1930s during the Depression, similar trajectory we've seen in other countries we've talked about so far, that it has a large population, which leads to industrialization, which leads to industrial worker-based parties and demands that start to grow and grow to the point where they become close to a majority of voters. And so the kind of political fights in the 1930s and 40s will be mostly between kind of moderate politicians and parties versus these populist parties that are largely supported by the working masses. So the working class is mobilizing on an ongoing basis in Colombia. Does not become a major political power until the 1940s, but they're on the road to achieving that in the 1930s. So most union members and especially union leaders, largely held pretty leftist political ideas like communism or socialism or a very leftist version of liberalism. But at the same time, they're also very nationalistic and they're very anti-imperialist. They view banks, and foreign companies with great suspicion. And they largely want to build up Colombia's industrialization for independence for the long term as quickly as they can. And one thing to remember about Colombia, even in the 1930s, over the half the population is in poverty, and there is great income inequality. So only 1% of the people in Brazil earn about 1/3 of all national income. So all money that's going to people for work or investment is going to the richest 1% uh, by about 1940. So there's extreme inequality in Colombia, which fuels a lot of populism and anger. So there's a lot of arguments within the Colombian elite and the politicians over how to respond to the Depression once it hit Colombia, and that really caused a big rift in the Conservative Party. And the Conservative Party kind of splits into different factions, which allows a Liberal Party politician to win the 1930 presidential election, and his name is Enrique Olaya Herrera. So that starts a kind of 15-year run of liberals and leftists that will win election after election, especially during the Depression and going into the 1940s. Their basic government policy is to increase the role that the government played in the economy, is a really basic and normal government stance that many governments throughout the world take to deal with the Depression. Even the United States, right in President Roosevelt's inauguration in 1933, he said that one of the great things that he's going to do to deal with the Depression in the U.S. is to, quote, increase executive authority, start hiring unemployed workers to become government employees. So that's really a very common thing that many governments throughout the world are doing to try to solve or end the Great Depression in the 1930s. So there's no real mystery there about what Colombia is doing. But just like in the 1930s in the United States, it pushes political polarization as people in the middle either join up with this more leftist interpretation of what government should be doing, or they kind of dig in against it and they join the right-wing parties that are directly opposed to it. So Herrera's big policy for his 4 years in office is to get a giant land reform law passed. And his idea is that the central government should control all uncultivated land. And if need be, the government should take over land that might be privately owned but just is not being used. And that if the government owns that land, it should redistribute that land to workers or poor peasants that will actually work and live on that land to get productivity going again, to get the economy going again. So this completely outraged the major landowners, obviously, who have vast tracts of land that they've tried to monopolize in order to control prices in the market. And they try to raise prices just by reducing supply of agricultural products. So they slow down their farms in order to raise prices so they can make more money. So it's a general monopolist kind of economic strategy to enrich themselves, and that had caused massive public outrage. And Herrera was trying to kind of harness that outrage to get this reform passed. But his major opponents in this are the landowners themselves. So Herrera does get the law passed during his term, but a later law is passed in 1936 that watered down the law and gave a lot more influence to landowners' personal titles over the land than any kind of peasant demands on the land or any kind of government oversight of the land. So after he terms out as president and he leaves office, the landowners will successfully push for another reform that undoes a lot of Herrera's attempt. So in Colombia, most of the really good farmlands are never redistributed, and that further fueled the anger amongst the peasants and the working class at the elite. So that fuels more populist sentiment in the country. Another election is held in 1934 that elects President Pumarejo. And he ran for president with strong support from working class and unions, and he talked about a giant revolution in government policy while he was campaigning. So once he becomes president, he gets some new laws passed that makes the president the final judge in a mediation between any strikes, between any workers and owners. So any of their disputes, the president can intervene, and President Pumarejo did intervene pretty consistently, and almost always on the side of the workers was the final decision. So that tended to, again, anger landowners and what Marx called the bourgeoisie, the factory owners. And another one of Pumarejo's giant reforms in his 4 years is to push through universal male voting rights. So every adult male will be able to vote after 1936. And that largely helps populism continue because in almost any society, the working class is the vast majority of that society. So the next president who's elected in 1938 is Eduardo Santos. He pushed for industrialization. That's what he based his campaign on, that Colombia should be able to run its own industrialization and finance its own industrialization without having to rely on foreign companies or foreign banks or foreign governments. And once he is elected and goes into office, his idea to accomplish that is to place tariffs on imports to do two things. Number one, gain revenue. And tariff is a tax on imports. So you raise tax rates on imports, the government will get more revenue, get more money, and they will use that money to help finance the creation of industrial factories in Colombia. And number two, whenever you see higher tax rates on imports, that means that those companies have to sell those goods in the market at higher prices than any goods that are produced in the country. And really, what I like to call Walmart theory kicks in, where if you as a customer go into a store and you see two items on the shelf that are basically the exact same, one is made in the country and one is imported, which means it had to pay the higher price, which means that it charges a higher price on the shelf for you to buy it, and it could be 10-20%. So you see one thing on the shelf for $50 and the other one exactly the same on the shelf for $45. Most customers buy the one for $45 because they want to save money. So this idea of protectionism, protectionist tariffs, it's called protectionism because it protects, it encourages customers to buy from the domestic companies that exist and make goods in that country, just through basically price warfare. So Santos pushed through this industrialization, and his theory is he wants Colombia to stop importing so much industrial-made stuff because that makes Colombia dependent on foreign countries for goods and therefore dependent on foreign economies. And instead to promote industrialization in Colombia itself so it can produce all the goods itself that its people need. And at the same time, he also pushed for the creation of an Instituto de Fomento Industrial, which translates to the Institute for Industrial Development, which again is a government-run system for financing and even starting construction on a lot of factories. And in Colombia, under Santos, the focus is on steel factories, rubber factories, building ships, ocean-going ships that can deliver Colombian-made goods around the world to grow the Colombian economy. And as the government revenues start to grow, because the government is also obviously taxing these industrial companies that are getting off the ground, he wants to use a lot of that government revenue to also invest in infrastructure around the country. Mostly kind of aqueducts and sewer systems to move water around. Colombia is a very mountainous area, and a lot of municipalities, a lot of cities are cut off from each other because of the mountains. So he wanted to build basic modern infrastructure for a lot of areas that just didn't have it yet. And he also pushes Colombia to build some kind of low-cost government housing structures so that poorer people could afford a decent place to live. So Santos is very popular in the country because he's implementing policies that the working class largely are demanding and have been demanding all throughout the 30s. As these are successful, that pushes the population to believe that this is working and that populism should continue. So another politician, it becomes even more populist in the late 30s going into the 1940s, and his name is Jorge Eliezer Gaitan. He was an anti-elitist politician with a very populist message. He gave very fiery speeches, that's why I like this picture of him at a mass rally, saying that there was an oligarchy, a group of economic elites, the extreme rich, who had up until 1930 politics and government and controlled most of the economy and used that power to oppress the masses and exclude them from good jobs that pay good wages, and to keep wages down. Anyone who works in a factory has horrible working conditions and it's very low pay. So he says that they largely monopolized the economy in Colombia and therefore used that wealth to control the country's politics so that really nothing would ever change. And that could include general working class, the so-called middle class of bureaucrats and teachers and lawyers and doctors and whatnot, the more highly trained, higher salaried employees, and any factory owners who spoke out against the oligarchy and what they were trying to do, and any landowners who spoke out against it. So Gaitan has this very anti-elitist, very populist message, and he used a lot of kind of fascist messaging systems that were reminiscent of some things that the Nazi Party had done in the 1920s and early 30s before Hitler really got into power and started running the German government. So use those as an example of how to run campaigns, how to run rallies and whatnot. So his basic message is that Colombia, the nation, needs what he called a, quote, moral restoration, end quote, to kick out the corrupt people and build a mass political party that could run the country for the benefit of all people equally. And to make a long story of his career very short, he is assassinated in April 1948, which caused a massive amount of popular outrage. He is assassinated in Bogota, the capital city of Colombia, and almost immediately riots break out in Bogota that spread to other cities, that becomes known as the Bogotazo in April 1948. So there's so much popular anger when he was murdered that people take to the streets and they start destroying things, even in the biggest cities. This scares the political and economic elites very badly, and really breaks apart a lot of the political unity movements that had existed in the 1930s and 40s, and that had led to a lot of liberals really winning elections ever since 1930 and staying in power. So this assassination, these riots, really just destroy the existing political system as it had been known for going back 20 years and had accomplished a lot of things. And another thing that gets going right after 1948 becomes known as La Violencia, which becomes really, it's an opportunity for elite politicians and their families, while this violence is going on, while the riots are going on, to start attacking and even murdering each other. Largely based on kind of old family disputes. Like one family hates another family, and they've run against each other in elections, and it's been very kind of, the rhetoric has been very ugly for a long time. And some of these kind of family clans start attacking each other violently now that this violence has broken out and is out of control for a while, and they see it as an opportunity to get rid of some people that they haven't liked for a long time. And you generally see that very often throughout human history. whenever government authority kind of goes away and there's chaos for a little while, people who have hated someone else for a long time, when murder is rampant and the police can't seem to stop it, and they can't even seem to investigate it very much because it's so overwhelming, the amount of violence, that they use it as an opportunity to kill off some people if they've hated. And so this starts amongst the kind of elite political families who start going after each other. But after that, it kind of spreads out from there as kind of street gangs and eventually even kind of Colombian mafia families start going after each other. And the violence really perpetuates itself. And eventually kind of mafia and street gangs take advantage of just this chaos that goes on for years to threaten average workers and to extort businesses. Extortion is basically where some gangster goes into a family-owned local supermarket or grocery store, any other business just with a storefront, and they say, you either pay me a certain amount of your money on a monthly or a weekly basis, a certain amount of your income, or I'm going to burn this place down and maybe kill some of your family. So a lot of street gangs and mafia groups took advantage of this kind of short-term riots and political violence to perpetuate this type of system and try to take control of major parts of the economy. And this kind of lawlessness, this mass amount of violence continues for a good 15 years until 1964, when the leading politicians have had enough and they come to a political agreement to end it and to end their own political bickering for the long term. But in that 15 years, historians have estimated somewhere around 200,000 people are killed. So this is a massive period of instability. If you can imagine something like that starting now in our own society and going for 15 years from now. 15 years is a long time when you're living in that kind of fear. And eventually that's what convinced leading politicians to form a kind of political truce and sign a treaty with each other to end this madness and try to rebuild stability in 1964. All right, and the next country we're going to talk about in this era is Argentina. And Argentina will become dominated by an individual politician named Juan Perón, who comes virtually out of nowhere in the 1940s to build a massive populist, nationalist, and pro-worker political party and movement. So a similar type of oligarchs, economic elites who had kind of monopolized the Argentine economy, had been really running the country up until about 1940. They often ran fraudulent elections and did whatever they could to retain political control so that they can continue with their massive profits. The military itself didn't really trust those politicians and viewed them as very corrupt. And the military had tried several coup attempts going up into the 1940s. All had failed until one in 1943 actually worked. It succeeded. It dissolved Congress, which the military hated anyway, and arrested a bunch of politicians and accused them of bribery and corruption and whatnot. The 1943 coup also ended all political parties and purged most of the administration, kicked them out of the government, and often threw many of them in jail if they had a good amount of evidence that they had committed real crimes. But even the ones they couldn't prove had committed crimes, they'd kick them out of politics anyway, kick them out of the government. So the only cabinet members that are really left are a few of the very radical ones who have participated in the coup in 1943 in the first place. And one of them is a colonel in the military named Juan Perón. He had taken part in the 1943 coup, and he was given the position after the coup in the new government, under the new administration. He was appointed Secretary of Labor, which at the time was a kind of small, third-rate, not important, not very visible administrative job. So he's in the high levels of the government administration, but he's not in a very famous, well-known position that most Argentines keep track of and know. They largely don't even know who who their labor secretary is for most of their history. So it was really a secondary thing. But Perón was a very smart politician, and he saw that urban workers were organizing, they were building unions that were growing, they were starting to unite with agricultural workers to build their movements, and that they were becoming increasingly literate, and that Argentine history had a lot of immigration. A lot of those immigrants were becoming either naturalized citizens or their children who had been born in Argentina were full-fledged citizens, and they're becoming old enough to vote by the 1940s. So Perón saw this going on and realized that it was a great opportunity if he wants, they're looking for a political leader, if he wants to kind of advertise himself to be their leader, that they could really launch him in politics. And so that's why he wanted the Secretary of Labor position, because he would use that post to advocate for the working class and factory workers and what he called the dispossessed, the people who work hard, that they're not paid very well at all, so they can never save money and build kind of family wealth for themselves and kind of launch themselves into, or their children, into the middle class or, you know, some higher level in society. So there's a lot of anger amongst those classes, and Perón recognized it, and he spoke to it. So he's very good at those kind of messages and getting certain reforms put in place that we really don't have time to go through in any great detail. But he basically rose up the ranks in the administration over the next few years. So he started off after the 1943 coup as Secretary of Labor, and then was appointed to a higher level, the Minister of War, which is basically the civilian administrator who oversees the military and defense posture and defense policy. So it's like Secretary of Defense in the United States. And the presidential election in 1946 largely came down to him and another candidate who the U.S. ambassador really drags down. When the ambassador starts publicly saying that Perón himself is kind of pro-fascist and might be a communist or something like that. So a lot of voters, once they hear that message coming from a leader from the United States, they distrust U.S. leaders so much by this point that when they hear the U.S. doesn't like Perón, a lot of voters vote for him just for that reason. So Perón gets 54% of the vote, wins an outright majority in that election, and becomes president. So Perón enters the presidency in 1946 and immediately does some of the things that he had promised to do. He creates a 5-year economic plan. So this is where we want the Argentine economy to be in 5 years, what we want revenue to be, how much economic growth we want, how much industrialization we want, and in what sectors. So it's a pretty detailed plan. He creates the Argentine Exchange Promotion Institute, which largely tries to control key agricultural exports in order to maximize the money that they can make off those exports and redistribute that money within the government to start building factories. So some historians have called Perón's government with this institute one of the most heavily state-controlled economies in the entire 1900s throughout all of Latin America. So it's a big shift in government policy and influence within the overall economy. And Perón again relied most heavily among the working classes, his support base, to push this through. And because he had such a military background and he had a lot of friends in the high officers in the military largely supports him doing this, and he gives big military budgets to retain that support. He also personally generally supported social justice and public welfare programs. So he is actively implementing a lot of demands that the working class has and the poor. And this generally becomes known as justicialismo. So that's the big term that floats around Argentina throughout his term in office. And it's a hugely popular thing, again, obviously, mostly amongst the poor and the working classes. So he had run for office on a very populist message. He promised solutions to the industrial problems that Argentina had faced in the years before he got into office. And he promised basically justice to the working classes that had been denied good wages and opportunity for promotion for so long. He was very much on the side of unionized labor, so he, as president, even publicly encouraged unions to go on strike and said that he would take the power as president to mediate conflicts between unions and their employers. And he did. He got involved and mediated, and most of his decisions fell on the labor side. So workers are very often kind of ecstatically supportive of him and what he's doing. And one of the biggest things is that he pushed through government policy to increase worker wages on a pretty large level. So their share of national income jumps by 50% of what they had been making before within just 2 years. So if you had been making, $100 a day, 2 years later you're making $150. So that's a giant leap in wage growth for the general working class. And that wage growth continues over the 5 years after that, increases another 25%. So you're looking at they've almost doubled their wages within 10 years. So that obviously gets a lot of workers on his side, and they stay on his side for the long term also. And a lot of them even to this day in what becomes known as the Peronist parties in Argentina that will continue for decades and decades. And largely the people who own those businesses, who employ those workers, are the ones who have to pay for it because they have to pay those higher wages by law. So a lot of the capitalists and the investor class and the landowners are paying for this, and they're not happy with Perón, and they grumble about it, and some of them start to talk about trying to overthrow him or run better candidates against him in the next elections to get him voted out of office. But because the general workforce are just the mass majority of the population, it's always going to be very difficult to defeat him in any election because he's just so popular amongst them because of what he's done for them. And there's a general economic boom that starts right when he starts implementing these policies. His first 3 years in office see gigantic amounts of general economic growth throughout the whole country. So most economists define good economic growth, solid economic growth, as 3% of the nation's economy per year. And once you get up to around 6% growth rates, that's when economists start to say growth is going a little bit too fast. It might become dangerous because you get things like inflation. So 3 to 6% is solid, good, reliable, very positive economic growth, according to most economists around the world. For instance, Argentina in 1946 got 8.6% economic growth just that year. The next year, it grew to 12%. So it's heating up very, very fast. In 1948, it fell back down to 5%, but still 5% is solid economic growth. So for the first few years, it looks like Perón's policies are working really, really well. And Perón is also a very nationalistic politician. He wants Argentina to develop its own industry, and he does not trust foreign companies to fund and build those factories in Argentina because, like many politicians, he argues that when foreign companies own your industrial base, they basically control much of your economy. So Perón also launched off on a process of nationalizing foreign companies, which means that the government takes over those companies and their property and basically kicks the foreign company out, the foreign managers out, and sometimes will run the company as just a government-run company basically, or sometimes will auction that company to the highest bidder of some other company or some other investor that is living in the country, has been born in the country. So there's several industries and individual companies that Perón nationalized, several railroads that were formerly owned by British companies, several major industrial companies like ITT from the United States, which is basically creating mass-produced goods in factories, really. A lot of the dock system, the import and export system of loading and unloading boats in Argentina's port system, those have been owned by French companies who had built that infrastructure, and Perón nationalized those also. So those are three of the biggest examples. But much like other nationalizations throughout the past 100 years or so, we've seen Perón's government didn't just take that stuff, just didn't take private property and then kick the foreign owners out, the former owners out. Actually compensated them, so gave them large amounts of money as compensation for the property that they had lost. And in Perón's instance, during this time, it was astronomical amounts of money at very high prices. So some people accuse Perón of giving over too much money, overpaying for what had been nationalized, basically. Another thing that Perón does while the economy is booming so heavily in 1947 is his government paid off the entire national debt, which is a giant step for independent development, because any country that owns big national debt, especially to foreign entities, is really at the mercy of those foreign entities. So he paid off the national debt in order to guarantee what he calls economic independence. He doesn't want to rely on foreigners to fund the government, and he doesn't want the government to borrow too much. He wants the government to pay its bills based on its own revenue. So he paid off the national debt and even issued what he called a Declaration of Economic Independence. So again, it seems like a lot of very fast progress in just his first few years in office. And Perón called this the New Argentina, that they are overcoming their historic problems. And Perón is so popular for doing all this that he has basically destroyed all political opposition. And not really through violence, just through his mass success as it's seen in the 1940s. So all the opposition parties that had argued against what he wanted to do, they're pretty much humiliated, because they said you shouldn't do this stuff or else it'll be a catastrophe, and it turns out to be just a booming economy and everything seems to be going right for the first few years. Problems do start to rise in 1949. Inflation skyrockets, as you can see in this graph, if I can get my little arrow in here. So inflation was fairly stable, around 20% or so in the late 1940s. And then 1949 it starts to really bump up real quick. So it grows by about a third very fast. And most economists argue that, again, that's the result of just too fast economic growth. That inflation is basically the rise in prices. And unless worker wages keep up, then workers can have a very big problem. You're not making enough money to buy food anymore. When inflation hit, that pushed the price of imports up, which created a trade deficit, which created a drop in exports, which did harm to the economy. And a lot of the institute that he was running to control exports had kept export prices very low, because he wanted to keep those prices low enough so the average workers in Argentina could buy those products. That contributed to a lot of this economic problem going into 1951, because prices were so low for those things to be sold on the shelf that it did not motivate new investment. So new companies don't generally start to rise in areas of the economy where they think they're not going to make a whole lot of money. So investors go after places to maximize their profit, and they tend to pull their money out of places where in the economy where their profits are shrinking. And the institute that Perón was running was guaranteeing low levels of profit. So not only do you get low export amounts, but you do not get an active investor class that is motivated to go into that sector of the economy to raise export levels. And Perón also started what many people call austerity, economists call austerity, which basically means budget cuts. Once he sees the government revenues falling, tax revenues falling, he starts cutting government spending because he doesn't want to borrow money to keep the government paying its bills. So he cuts government spending. He reduces the amount of loans the government is giving to private businesses to get off the ground. He starts limiting wage increases for the working class. So he starts responding in the early 1950s to this economic problem with really a lot of the opposite of populism, which is budget cuts, slowing down wage growth and whatnot. He had the old Constitution amended to allow him to run for a second term as president, which he runs for in 1951. And even with these, his reemergent kind of austerity politics and whatnot, budget cuts, he's still overwhelmingly reelected by the working class who respond so well to what he had been doing before. So he's elected with 2/3 of the vote in 1951, which is a very large proportion. He had also pushed for women to gain voting rights, and so they supported him obviously in this election. And he pushed for his wife to become his vice presidential nominee in 1951. So that gets a lot of female voting support also. But eventually the military refused to allow that. So they really threatened Perón to stop his wife from becoming vice president because there's a lot of sexism in the country still, especially amongst the military. And the military said, well, if something happens to you and suddenly we have a female president, we don't want to follow orders from a female president. So there's still a lot of very deeply ingrained sexism in the culture, and especially in the military culture. And Evita, his wife, actually was diagnosed with cancer the next year, 1952, and died fairly quickly. And so she becomes a giant kind of cultural hero to a lot of women in Argentina, and even to a lot of the working class in Argentina. So she's still remembered today as a pillar of their beliefs and a sign of progress for them. So Perón, by this point, 1951, he has his own political party that's basically known as the Peronist Party, creative title there. And in order to guarantee his re-election, he also does some fairly repressive things. He shuts down any newspapers that are opposed to him in 1951 who complained about his policies or his changes to the Constitution. But his government policies, his spending, his austerity and budget cuts really seem to revitalize the economy and slow down the inflation rates growth. So he goes into a second term in 1951, pretty popular, and the economy is recovering from that short-term emergency. And at this point he launches another 5-year plan in 1952 that is much less populist than the first one he had done, has much lower wage growth, not much at all, and even makes a deal with a foreign oil company from the United States in 1954 that's actually from California. And in that deal, the company demanded a 2-year wage freeze on those workers that are going to work in that industry. So he's in this position where he says that he's a populist and he's supporting the working classes and he's opposed to foreign intervention in the Argentine economy. But at the same time, he is also inviting a foreign company to build up oil production and to limit wages, oil worker wages, for 2 years. So there's a lot of criticism that he's saying one thing and doing something else. But again, most of the general working class continue to support him because they feel they've really gotten a lot out of his presidency. He still sees his big political challenge. Any opponents to him are probably amongst the economic elite, the wealthy in the country, the big landowners, the big industrialists and whatnot. And even some of the military start questioning him. So he tries to kind of shore up his support amongst younger officers in the military, but it doesn't work. And in 1954-55, the military is kind of split on whether or not to support him, and some military officers go to him and say that he needs to resign. He needs to leave office with no election or anything, or else they're going to try to start a civil war against him. And that scares him so badly that he resigns. That he resigns in September 1955 without trying to mobilize his supporters, without trying to hold mass rallies and bring his supporters out into the streets, without even trying to convince the military to stop this against him. He really just suddenly and shockingly resigns in September of 55 and goes into exile in Paraguay. And he'll stay there for a while, and then I think he goes on to Spain. But that's the end of Perón in Argentina. But he had been so popular that other populist politicians will take up his arguments and try to run for office. So that'll be an ongoing story, this Peronist idea going forward in Argentina for the next several decades. And the last two countries we'll talk about real briefly. In the 1930s and 40s, Peru really alternates back and forth between military dictatorships that tend to be very conservative, and whenever they allow elections to happen, populist candidates win those elections and sometimes go into office, and they will try to implement reforms, and then a military coup happens against them. So Peru is very back and forth between military dictatorship and popular government for many years, for about 50 years, from 1919 until about 1968, 69, 70. And Costa Rica creates a very stable democracy by 1930. Most historians argue largely because it is a fairly racially homogenous society, so it's mostly kind of white Europeans in Costa Rica by 1930. And so that created a fairly stable democracy because there's not a lot of racial hatreds floating around. Because everybody tends to basically look like each other. They all speak the same language and whatnot. So Costa Rica's political system is very stable throughout these populist era. They will implement some populist reforms, but liberal parties and conservative parties basically go back and forth in winning elections from 1930 forward and even to today. And whenever a communist party or a radical leftist party might rise up and have a good chance at winning an election, the liberals and conservative parties in Costa Rica will kind of unite behind one candidate to get all the vote for just that one person to keep the communists out of office. So Costa Rica is a very stable democracy from about 1930 all the way up to today, and probably one of the most stable in all of Latin America, and definitely the most stable in all of Central America.